Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Capital Connection. I am Conan Smith. I'm the president and CEO of the Michigan Environmental Council. And today we are going to bring you a conversation about the future of transportation, because there is a lot of great stuff starting to percolate in the capital, in Southeast Michigan, across the state of Michigan. We're thinking about mobility differently, finally, than we have done in a very long time. I'm really pleased to bring on to today's show representatives from two of MEC's member organizations. We got Megan Owens, who is the executive director at Transportation Riders United. Megan is a longtime friend of mine and MEC's. She actually, I think, Megan, you first got involved with MEC when you worked at Purgem, isn't that right?
That is correct.
So
20 years ago now.
That was back in the day. And back in the day, Charles Griffith was working at the Ecology Center where he is still today. And Charles manages their, I guess, alternative transportation work. Is that a fair way to say it, Charles?
Oh, yeah, it's actually more broad. Climate and energy.
Oh, right. Yeah, of course. Like your whole portfolio is climate and energy. And we worked on the transportation stuff closely, particularly with electric vehicles. And Charles has been representing the environmental community at the state level within MEDC for many years. We have some big things going on that we're going to talk to these two folks about. But why don't I start, Charles, by just asking you to introduce yourself to the crew in terms of like your background and history and the kind of work that the Ecology Center has been doing on vehicle electrification and new mobility.
Yeah, I was trying to decide how far to date myself on this work, but you've kind of already let the cat out of the bag that I go way back. Let me just say this, that early in my career, I actually worked more on the sort of toxic pollution side of things. And we were doing work at the Ecology Center focused on the toxic chemicals that go into automobile production, and trying to get the auto companies to phase those out or to significantly reduce their use. But at the same time, we're fully aware that the use of fossil fuels in those same automobiles was a huge pollution source itself. And we decided that we needed to be part of that conversation that was happening as well. And at that time, it had been 30 years since the United States had updated its fuel economy standards, and we had a big opportunity to change that. And we decided we also needed to get involved to bring a unique kind of Michigan and auto production states perspective to that, because of all the jobs and economic dependence or economic importance of that industry to our states, and that we needed strong policy, but we needed it to be nuanced enough that it wouldn't sort of disadvantage our region. So I was really glad we got involved in that. One other quick little story is that I really enjoyed working with one of your predecessors, Conan, Lana Pollock, the wonderful Lana Pollock. During that time, I remember being at one auto show in Detroit, where we were both standing out in front with these signs asking the automakers, the big three automakers, when they were going to build their first hybrid electric car, and suggesting that they're going to get left behind if they didn't catch up with where the rest of the industry was going. And of course, some of those same arguments are germane today around electrification, full electrification of vehicles. But at least I'm happy to say that the big three are getting on that task, and it's now a matter of whether our public policy can help accelerate that trend.
I remember, Charles, that very situation. I was a junior staffer at MEC at the time, and excuse me, I think Lana came back agitated and frustrated because she'd been such a strong supporter of the union labor that goes into our automotive sector. And at the time, hybrid vehicles weren't being produced by American car companies. And she sort of raised her fist and said, no more. And a couple of weeks later, I think she drove a Prius to work. And that was a very strong signal about the direction that I think the American autos needed to go. Megan, how did you get involved in this?
Yeah, speaking of how far back to go, I decided when I was a kid I was going to save the world. Like you guys grew up in Ann Arbor, yeah, I think both of you guys grew up in Ann Arbor, and knew that I wanted to be a part of making the world a better place, and went to the U of M School of Natural Resource and the Environment, as they called it then. My thesis back then was on climate change and the public policy that was needed to tackle the threat of climate change. So I did work in the environmental side for a while, and then have been working for almost 15 years on public transit, which certainly has a lot of environmental connection, but I honestly spend more of my time talking about the community benefits and the economic benefits, and how do we ensure everyone has access to the places that they need to go. But it's really nice to see these pieces coming together and recognize that we can tackle the climate crisis while we are giving people more options and addressing inequity, and so many of these pieces, so many of these community needs tie really well together.
I remember working with you, Megan, on the ballot proposal for the Regional Transit Authority some years ago. And one of the points that you hammered home with the advocacy community is if we want sustainable cities, like they've got to have places that are connected to the residents. And you showed this map of the hospitals and the parks and the schools and how they weren't connected by public transit to the housing. And it just, it opens your eyes so much. So if we want a sustainable future, we've got to think about, how people are getting around in these places in these cities to the places they need to go.
I mean, every one of us is one broken leg or one broken axle away from needing rides to get around. And no one wants to always be dependent on friends and family for rides. So let's make sure we have public options for everyone, whether you live in Royal Oak or you live in Novi, whether you live in Lansing or you live in Muskegon.
So in 2020, Governor Whitmer made it the state's goal to be carbon neutral by 2050. And a huge part of that challenge is in our transportation sector still. Charles, you were tapped by the governor to lead the transportation mobility section of the Council on Climate Solutions for the state. And you've been convening advocates and experts, I think it's for a year now, and just came out with a set of recommendations that are open for public comment right now. Part of what we want to encourage folks in the audience to do is learn about the recommendations that are coming from the council and to weigh in, please, in favor of all of the great things that folks like Charles have facilitated. In the transportation sector, can you describe, Charles, a little bit from your perspective, how it plays into our climate solution model?
Well, yeah, I think, the first thing to start with is, that transportation now is our number one source, at least by sector, of carbon emissions. So, as the electricity sector has thankfully started to decarbonize, and our automobile and transportation sector is still not there. I mean, we see some good trends starting up, but in Michigan, electric vehicles are less than 1% of sales, let alone actual vehicles on the road today. So we have so far to go on that front. But if I might say just a word about the work group that I helped to co-lead, and that Megan was a great colleague of mine in that effort. We quickly broke our group's focus down into sort of two main groups. We had a little friendly sort of tension about which was more important at the very beginning, but we quickly determined, I think, that we needed one group to focus on how can we accelerate this electrification transition and make sure that we can get to, I mean, really, we pretty much need to electrify all of our vehicles, including heavy and medium duty trucks in the next 1 to 2 decades. I mean, otherwise we don't really have a hope for, decarbonizing the sector. But secondly, we have to be mindful, and that we created a second group around, we can't just continue to drive everywhere and to increase the amount of miles that we're putting on the road. We have to, that makes reaching those goals much harder. And to the points that have already been made before, it leaves a lot of people behind if they can't drive an automobile or can't afford to drive an automobile everywhere they need to go. So from an equity perspective alone, it's key that we consider ways to give people options outside of their automobiles. So the 2 sets of recommendations are really about those 2 things.
So Megan, as a participant in that process, how would you characterize the discourse inside the council with yourself as an advocate, and then the industry folks who were reliant on to make sure that good things happen? Was it cordial? Was it forward thinking? Do you feel positive?
It was a pretty positive conversation. There was, and again, partially, I mostly worked with the folks focused on how do we decrease how much people drive? How do we give people more choices? The VMT, Vehicle Miles Traveled work group. But it was really neat to see how many people wanted positive progress, how much people were open to a lot of these ideas. There was very little pushback against the idea that, we got to give people more choices for getting around. Everyone's like, yeah, duh. I mean, there were some useful discussions about how does this impact urban versus rural areas, and how do we ensure everyone's needs are addressed. There was a little bit of pushback from the Michigan Department of Transportation. That was really the only area. They're like, well, as people drive more, the economic development grows. Therefore, if we drive less, somehow that's bad for the economy, which is absurd. But the perception has for so long been driving equals good, that it's going to take a while to really persuade this state that you can drive less and have as much or better economic vitality, especially in our core cities where people are, and especially when we're most families spend 20% of their entire family budget just on their cars and gas and insurance. How much more economic impact could we have if people had 15% more of their entire household budget that they were able to put towards other things in our economy? So there was a little bit of pushback on that, but Charles and the other folks in the work group really looked at ways that we can find compromise, that we could, and even less than compromise, that we could frame what needs to happen in a way that everyone could feel good about, that there wasn't sort of a negative perception to some of these things.
Charles, I'm going to put up a slide with the top 3 big 3 recommendations. But the council, the work group that you all were on, came out with 5 major recommendations and then a whole series of complementary ones. Can you talk a little bit about that set of priorities from the work group, and what really, from your perspective, needs to happen at the state of Michigan to accelerate EV usage and to make sure that mobility that is sustainable is at the center of our transportation processes?
Sure. Yeah, I think like you said, there were 5 main recommendations that came out, in part because that's what we were asked to provide. And then there were some additional recommendations that our work group came up with that I feel are important as well. But they kind of fit into these categories, which I think you've pulled out pretty well. Starting at the bottom, perhaps, the idea behind accelerating electrification is we need a lot more infrastructure, and we need more incentives to help folks make this transition, given the still, somewhat higher price point for electric vehicles, even though there can be, fuel savings and maintenance savings from those vehicles over time. That upfront price premium can still be a disincentive. And so that's important. The group also, I should say, really was charged by the governor to look at equity and how do we also address historical disparities as we're coming up with our climate solutions. And so I think we did pretty well at looking at the need to make sure that we're prioritizing low and moderate income households when we come up with something like our incentives, or when we're deploying charging infrastructure, that we're making it accessible, making that charging accessible to everyone, including disadvantaged communities, rural communities, et cetera. So that's one piece. And then I also mentioned earlier that we're also looking at heavy and medium duty vehicles, including trucks and delivery vans, but also buses and our transit and school buses for kids. I mean, these go through all of our communities. Trucking in particular is a major source of pollution for many of our communities that are hardest hit by other sources of pollution as well. So that, we think, needs to be a priority. And I think that came out in our recommendations that trucks need to be an emphasis of our work as well. And then, Megan really led some of the efforts on the transportation planning aspects and public transit. How do we encourage public transit? But we're calling for a major increase in investment in these kinds of alternative mobility. We shouldn't even call it alternative mobility anymore. It's just it's a non personal passenger vehicle option, and that requires a public investment, and we need a lot more of it. And thankfully, there is some additional funding coming from the federal government to support public transit as part of the infrastructure bills that were just passed, and that may provide some additional support for this, but the state can still do that on its own and make this a higher priority. Let me stop there.
Yeah, this one at the top was really intriguing to me, because in the energy sector, one of the most powerful drivers we have is the integrated resource planning process that utilities go through now with the Public Service Commission, looking long term to how they're going to source their energy and allowing the public to weigh the environmental costs and benefits there. Sounds like you're recommending something very similar in the transportation sector.
Yeah, right now, a lot of the transportation decisions, whether made at the state or county or city level, the main focus is how can we ensure the most cars can drive as smoothly as possible without traffic delays, and without too many bumps and potholes. That's the main priority, but we know that transportation impacts so much more. So if we can at least get the climate impact of those transportation decisions to be an important part of the transportation decision-making process. And the other side, the public health component. Unfortunately, far too many people are getting killed when they walk and bike on our streets in Michigan. So making it safer and easier for people to walk and bike, as well as to use transit. If we can get transportation decisions, as you alluded, to incorporate things like pedestrian safety, things like equity and affordability, things like climate crisis, when deciding whether to widen a road or where to build new infrastructure, that could be a huge change. That could be a dramatic shift.
Charles, did you all talk about the integration of this thought process into the manufacturing side of the equation as well, especially when it comes to incentives and tax credits that the state might provide to industry?
Yeah, a little bit. We did acknowledge that there was a need to provide incentives there, as well as for workforce development, to retrain and reskill folks so that they can enter in, so that they can benefit, Michiganders can benefit from this transition. I mean, there are definitely concerns on the labor side that jobs from our, mostly internal combustion based transportation industry could lose out on. So, but at the same time, there are a lot of new jobs that can be created in these new industries, but we have to make sure that Michiganders are able to take advantage of that. And some of those jobs are going to be on the electricity side, rebuilding and improving our grids so that we can have, more clean electricity powering not only our transportation, but I know MEC and the Ecology Center, we both are working on electrifying our buildings sector as well, to get off of fossil fuels.
Megan, we have a question in the Q&A that I think is like right up your alley, from Stephen Vagnosi, who I think is a friend. He's curious how we collectively influence MDOT to plan for improved public transit, especially passenger rail. What is our process for advocacy there?
Well, it's interesting how each one of these recommendations, it may seem simple, but every one of these recommendations could be huge game changers in how the state operates. If right now the MDOT, they measure their progress, they have a set of performance measures, and among those are things like how old is the bus fleet, but they don't really take into they've never really gotten the directive that MDOT, part of your job is to ensure everyone in the state can get where they need to go, regardless of whether they drive. If we can actually get the governor through the Michigan Climate Council to specifically say, hey, MDOT, that's part of your job. You're not just building highways, you're ensuring everyone has access, sustainable, affordable access. That could be a real game changer. They're starting to make some tiny steps in the right direction. I worked with them a lot on their most recent long range transportation plan, and they're at least incorporating all of the modes together and realizing where they have huge gaps in information. They don't even know where in the state has pedestrian and bike infrastructure. So they've got to really evaluate some of those things. So I do think that not only getting these ensuring that the final recommendations, or that the final climate plan includes these recommendations, is one important piece that's going to happen over the next 2 months. I think the actual climate, we've got recommendations and ideas so far. The draft climate plan is going to come out January 14th, I think they said, and they're going to ask for public input. So ensuring that transportation, bus and rail and pedestrian are an important part of this climate plan is one great path. And then let's keep it going. Let's look throughout the course of the next year or two, how can we keep working together to encourage / require that MDOT really become more than a highway department. And that's going to take some real direction from the governor.
Charles, the recommendations that are coming out of your task force are powerful. We want to make sure that they are incorporated into the plan, as Megan says. Can you talk a little bit about your vision for that process to ensure that they are in the plan, and what we as advocates can do to support the task force?
Yeah, I think as has been mentioned, I mean, the work group recommendations have been submitted to the full council and to Eagle That's the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, for those not familiar with that. And Eagle is basically the agency that's convening the council and will be writing up this draft plan. So the recommendations from the work groups are in front of the council and Eagle right now, and public comment is helpful right now because the plan is being written, or at least it's been being started to be written. They don't have a whole lot. They only have another month to get it out according to their own schedule. So that's one opportunity. And then, as Megan mentioned, when the draft plan is out, there'll be another round of public comment where we can provide some additional feedback on whether we think they got it right or not. But so I think those are right now, and also in starting in mid-January, are both really important times for the public voices to be heard on this.
I put a slide up for the audience. Our organizations collectively have launched a sign-on letter to support the recommendations that are coming out of several of the task forces on this council. Encourage folks to add their names and their organizations to that effort, show our collective might and support for this work. And I am confident that our organizations will be collaborating to make sure that advocacy voice is strong. We're very fortunate to have, Charles, folks like you who are in the mix there. And please continue to let us all know how we can be more supportive if you see things starting to go awry. Not that they will. We've got great leadership there, but never hurts to have a little muscle behind you, right?
Right. And, there'll be other voices out there too that may be less excited about the recommendations. So we always need to make sure our voices are being heard to be a counterbalance to the less friendly voices that might be out there.
Megan, can we talk a little bit about alternative modes of transportation? As Charles says, maybe we should stop talking about them as alternatives and start talking about them as the reality that we want to experience. For example, passenger rail. How do we get increased passenger rail between our core cities and our major destinations, whether that's getting from Detroit to Ann Arbor, as you and I have long discussed, or from the capital to Detroit, our major city, or even up to Traverse City, one of the major tourism and vacation destinations in the state. How do we push forward these models of transportation inside a car culture and inspire people to experience different things?
I mean, one thing is we have had to acknowledge that these are options. We're not trying to take away people's cars. We want to give people affordable, sustainable options for getting around. And everybody should have a wide variety of options. But it does come down to investment. This country, this state has spent trillions and trillions of dollars on the highway and road network. And so we really do need investment in our rail and transit network. Thankfully, Amtrak Joe in the White House is a big supporter, and there's something like double the investment in rail that are from the federal level, as opposed to the whatever 30% increase in bus funding that's coming. We'll take what we can get. But we also need that investment from the state level. Again, more than 90% of all state transportation dollars go into our roads. We need to convince our leaders to shift that just a little bit more and to give people to invest in those real choices. There's some great plans out there. There's some great studies. Our friends at Groundwork Center have some fabulous efforts underway to get up to Traverse City. We know how to do these things, but they take funding. So definitely make sure. I will say, when I've spoken to the governor and the lieutenant governor, they say when they're all around the state, they hear about roads and potholes. So we need, as a advocacy community, to be reaching out more often and to be bringing up the need for transportation options as many times as we can. Over the next year, it's going to be an election year. Use those chances to tell every one of our local, state, federal leaders that you want to see greater investment in transit, in walking, in biking, in rail, and of course, in electrification of our vehicle infrastructure.
Charles, there's an intersection on the vehicular side between this transition to electric vehicles and how we source electricity in the state in order to charge those vehicles. Can you talk a little bit about how we improve and radically increase the use of electricity for transportation without taking a backward step on the electric generation side?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. A lot of folks have a concern about that. I mean, I think my quick answer is that just as this climate council looked at 5 major sectors, one of them being electricity. The electricity sector is clear. For that sector, we're clearly set on how do we get to net carbon neutrality very quickly, because we know that we're going to be increasing our reliance on electricity that is increasingly clean. So that trend has to happen, and it has to happen in parallel with our electrification efforts here, because we just don't have time to do this sequentially. If we're going to meet our 2050 carbon goals, we have to be on all cylinders for all of these sectors. So we have to have confidence that we're going to clean up the grid as we're increasingly electrifying our vehicles. And that means that an electric vehicle bought today is going to be cleaner each year as we increase our use of renewables, for example. I love solar powered sort of canopies where you might co-locate solar in a parking lot with electric charging, but in general those are going to be not you're not necessarily producing the solar at the same time that you're charging, and so they're nice, but I don't think we should constrain our charging stations with being only powered directly by solar. We just need solar everywhere. And we're getting there. Cities like Ann Arbor, where I live, I'm thankful, has this 820 plan where they want to have all renewables by 2030. So it's like everything will be powered by renewables in a very short period of time if we can make it work. So all electric vehicle charging would be powered by renewables in that same time frame. So I think we need to think bigger like that we just need to be decarbonizing all of these sectors at the same time.
We are at the hour, and I want to say thank you to the both of you, Megan and Charles, for your leadership and for your willing to take some time to share with the advocacy community today how these climate recommendations are shaping up and how we can all get involved in them. For those of you in the audience, I strongly encourage you to visit the websites of the Ecology Center and True. They are chock full of great information, great ways to stay engaged in this fight. And again, Megan, Charles, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today.
Thanks for having us, and for your ongoing leadership in this fight for a lot of years together, huh?
Yeah, it's been fun.
Yes.
Glad to be here today, Conan. Thanks for having us.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next time on the next Capital Connection. Until then, be safe and be well. Farewell.